Each year, new state legislation aims to prop up the industrial agriculture system. So we're going to have some folks talking about how advocates are working to beat back the powerful big ag lobby and teaming up with elected officials to find solutions that support regenerative food systems, social justice, climate initiatives, public health, and more. We have lots of heavy hitters on this panel discussion as well. One of them I get to work with every day. She's amazing. She's a rock star. Her name is Ashlen Busick, and she's the director of SRAP's Food and Farm Network, where she connects impacted communities and ally organizations through coalition building and policy advocacy across the U.S. She grew up on a family farm in northern Missouri next to one of the state's largest corporate hog operations. So she knows this pretty much since birth. And her family's ongoing battle for justice and advocacy for family farms inspired her to follow in her grandfather, Terry Spence's footsteps. He worked for SRAP and actually was the executive director when I came in 2020. So I'm here to introduce the wonderful Ashlen, and you can take it over from here.
Thanks so much, Sherry. I'm super happy to be with you all today, calling in from North Missouri still. I'm still here. I couldn't move very far. But as I was preparing for this panel, and I'm super excited to introduce some of these folks to you all, as I was preparing for this panel this morning, I realized how just one piece of legislation, even just one amendment, can really change the trajectory of a state or a region. And in fact, that's why I'm here at all. It was all because of one amendment that was added to a bill at the end of Missouri's session that exempted 3 counties in North Missouri from the corporate farming law. That's the whole reason that I ended up getting involved in this, and that my family had to fight for as long as they did. It paved the way for then Premium Standard Farms and now Smithfield to build massive swine operations in our region. So our panelists today definitely understand that and have been working diligently to protect their communities and states from the ag lobby's attempts to prop up this system. And this livestock model, industrial livestock model. So not only doing that, but also striving for positive legislation that supports farmers and promotes a more socially responsible food system. So today we're going to talk about that work and dive into some of the trends that we're seeing at those darn bills that pop up from state to state, and also just what this means for advocates and how we proactively work with decision makers at the state capitol. So we have with us today Jane Egan, who is a longtime community and environmental advocate and chair of the Lancaster Hills Alliance in Nebraska. We have Lisa Doerr, a community leader and coalition builder and steering committee member of the Sustain Rural Wisconsin Network. We have Melissa Vatterott, who is the policy director for Missouri Coalition for the Environment. We have Charlotte Jameson, who is the chief policy officer at Michigan Environmental Council. And we have Kendra Kimbirauskas, who is the Senior Director of Agriculture and Food Systems at State Innovation Exchange. So thank you all so much for joining us today. And again, just this list of names and the work that you all do, it inspires me daily. So I feel very privileged to talk with you. So let's start with Jane. Jane Egan is a dedicated community organizer and environmental activist who for more than 50 years has served as a board member and fundraiser for various nonprofit organizations in Nebraska. She currently holds a position of chair at the Lancaster Hills Alliance, which is an organization playing a crucial role in creating strict new regulations for concentrated animal feeding operations in her county. Last year, Jane organized and moderated a public education forum titled What's in Our Water, Nebraska, that featured a panel of experts who explored the relationship between nitrates in drinking water and known health issues in humans. So Jane also assisted a group this past year of concerned citizens in Gage County who opposed the approval of a large hog finishing operation near their township. So she is actively involved in political actions and frequently testifies at the Nebraska unicameral and local governing boards. Jane, your list goes on and on, so thank you so much for joining us. In this past legislative session, when a bill was introduced that would prohibit the important work you've been doing at the local level, you all brought an army, for lack of a better word. So tell us about LB 1375, what that bill was, and why this would have been particularly detrimental to local government and communities facing industrial livestock operations.
Well, thank you so much, Ashlen, for having me, and to the other panelists. This is a wonderful opportunity to share information on a wide basis. LB 1375, that stands for Legislative Bill 1375, was introduced in January of this year at our unicameral. And the primary sponsor of it was our governor. And to give some context to my presentation, I want to explain the relationship of Nebraska's current governor to the bill 1375. It's one that he hoped would be introduced and passed in this last unicameral, which just adjourned here a few days ago. Jim Pillen was elected governor in 2023. He is the CEO of Pillen Family Farms. It's the largest hog confinement operation in Nebraska to date. He inherited his farm and from his parents, and he is an active veterinarian. In the 1990s, he started Pillen Family Farms to grow the hog operation. And in the early 2000s, he acquired DNA genetics to research and develop traits that are desirable in hogs that are raised for meat. He is a very big player in supporting corporate ag in Nebraska and welcomes other corporate ag interests to come to Nebraska. His interest in sponsoring LB 1375 was to diminish the local control of citizens over land use permits in their counties. This scheme was the direct result of a 6,500 head hog confinement operation that was proposed for Liberty Township in Gage County. It's a county in the extreme southeast corner of Nebraska. It's a beautiful area. It's a lot of watersheds, a lot of waterways there. The citizens that were living or that are living and operating legacy family farms adjacent to the proposed operation were opposed to it from the beginning. The land use change was certainly threatening to their water and land resources, and didn't want the smell, didn't want the truck traffic, all of the things that go along with such a huge operation. And so they reached out, they started researching what these hog confinements would mean for their area. And one of them that they reached out was some connection to Ashlen at SRAP. And then Ashlen, in turn, referred the lead organizer of the group that opposed it to me and two of my colleagues. We had experience here in Lancaster County. We're just north of Gage County. And so we've had experience in fighting the Costco chicken barns and other animal feeding operations. So we volunteered to help this little group. They were totally uninformed, had never done anything like this before, and really needed to have some help from experienced people that had done it before. Well, that little group was able to defeat it, and it was kind of a strange thing the way it happened. The county planning and zoning board down there deferred the permit approval to the 7-member county board of commissioners. And one member of that board was not allowed to vote, and I won't go into the reasons for that. It was weird. But the vote ended up 3-4 approving the permit and 3 against. That did not meet the required majority needed to pass, and so the special permit just died on the vine. It was basically denied. Governor Pillen was unhappy that citizens could have the power to reject a CAFO special permit, and decided to try to make a state law that would make it more difficult for local control over these CAFO permits. And so the proposed law that he had several undemocratic amendments to it. One of the most egregious was to allow local boards to decide whether they wanted to hold public hearings on zoning changes or not, which means if they decided not, if they were greatly influenced by these big corporations, that they could decide not to even hold the public hearing. The other really egregious amendment was that if a hearing was not held in a 90-day shot clock period, the zoning change would automatically be adopted with no research, no input from local control. So 87 of us on our side opposing this organized, and we went to the governmental committee that was hearing this initially before it would be sent to the full unicameral for a vote. And we just overwhelmed them with opposition, and it died there in the committee and never made it out to the floor. We do anticipate that in the next unicameral next year, it'll come back, it'll have a different iteration. I don't think they're going to let this go, but we are definitely supportive of local control. People in counties and cities need to be able to have their voices heard. We need to keep our democracy strong at the local level. We cannot let the state dictate to local boards, planning and zoning and county commissions on these special land use permits. That is strictly needs to be left at the local control. So that one we won, but there's others to come down the pike, I'm sure, because CAFOs are coming into Nebraska. They have for several years. We fought the Costco chicken barns. They started in coming here in 2016 in our county of Lancaster. Our group formed, but we didn't have good regulations in place, and so we lost our fight, and one was allowed to come in with a 4-barn operation. But as a result of that, we were able to convince the county commissioners to organize a task force that developed new regulations, because they practically did not exist at all on the books for Lancaster County. And those resulted in the strictest, as Ashlen said, the strictest regulations in Nebraska against CAFOs coming in. And we have not had a new CAFO application since those regulations were passed. So that was a win. So anyway, I'm all for small d democracy and local control.
Yes, thank you so much, Jane. And I'm glad that you mentioned the shot clock concept, because I recall actually seeing that in another bill this year in a different state, this idea, because that was one of the key things that prolonged that scenario in Gage County was residents were asking enough questions. They were able to prolong this series long enough. But yeah, that idea that it should be dictated how long agencies have or local governments have to approve a permit. But on another note, this definitely isn't the first time you all have had to rally at the Capitol, because as you mentioned, you and allies in the state have been pushing back on Costco's Lincoln Premium Poultry Project in eastern Nebraska. And so I recall last year you also were successful in beating a backup bill. Would you mind just for a couple minutes to talk about the Right to Farm bill that was proposed last year?
That was Legislative Bill 662. Costco representatives decided that they didn't want to be burdened with lawsuits, nuisance lawsuits from adjacent landowners to their chicken barn operations. Currently, the law says that citizens have 2 years to file a nuisance lawsuit against a bad actor. So Costco and their wholly owned subsidiary, Lincoln Premium Poultry, which operates the chicken processing plant in Fremont for Costco, decided that they wanted to reduce the 2-year time limit down to 1 year. And again, we saw that as taking democracy away from the hands of local citizens living near or adjacent to these operations. And in order to protect their interests, we opposed that. And again, that was one that was defeated. We do anticipate that one coming back as well. I'm sure they'll come back at us again. but
Right.
it's like whack-a-mole. And but our various organizations are working together. We're watching it along with the help from SRAP, so that if anything pops up, we have land use attorneys, we have lobbyists that are watching all of these things, and they're members of our organizations, and they're keeping us all apprised so that when something pops up, we can organize very quickly and get great numbers to testify.
Right. Yes. Well, thank you so much for that overview. Let's turn now to Lisa Doerr in Wisconsin. So Lisa and her husband produce hay for small livestock farms in far northwestern Wisconsin. Lisa chaired a partnership of 6 townships that developed local livestock ordinances, which legally finesse state right to farm laws. Now she's working with townships across Wisconsin interested in adopting similar ordinances. So still, considering this idea of local control and what communities have the ability to do at the local level to protect themselves. So we'll pop a website in the chat where you can learn more about those ordinances and the work they did. But specifically for this conversation, last winter, the Farm Bureau passed the bill, this past winter, so this past session, the Farm Bureau passed a bill designed to preempt these ordinances called the Protect Our Farms Act. So Lisa is here to talk about the efforts they organized to get Governor Evers to veto that legislation. So Lisa, I'll pass it to you.
Great. Thanks a lot, Ashlen. And thank you to SRAP for this, bringing us all together. It's really great to put some faces on the names. So yeah, the Farm Bureau and their industry proxies have claimed for years that our local livestock ordinances were illegal in Wisconsin. And we always knew that was a lie, but last winter the mask came off, and they started this stealth legislative campaign to preempt our supposedly already illegal ordinances. And it was kind of interesting because they used the Wisconsin bear hunters as cover, and the legislation that they put forth appeared to address concerns about local regulation of hunting dogs. And this tack made it possible for them to get a hearing in this pretty obscure Senate committee called the Sporting Heritage Committee. And so I just cued that for you guys. I don't know what goes on in other states, but we have these funny little committees. And so as the session came kind of barreling to a close, like it always does, they started changing their story. And they started explicitly telling legislators that they really, really needed to preempt our local livestock ordinances. And it was interesting because the language of the bill was very limited, but they were kind of widening that legislative intent and laying the groundwork for some future amendments to preempt local control. So it was pretty obvious. So in response, we organized a veto strategy in about 2 weeks, because this thing popped up like the old whack-a-mole deal. And it was somewhat of an extra challenge because it was this obscure bill that no one had really been paying any attention to. So we worked with the Sustain Rural Wisconsin Network, which is a network of very loose network of people that SRAP helped put together. Mary Doherty from SRAP has done great work with it. And we put together a 3-pronged strategy that I call the 3M strategy. And that is message, mobilization, and media. And, it's kind of catchy, 3M. Get your Post-it notes out. So as you guys know, when it comes to messaging on livestock factories, it's pretty hard to be short and positive. But we really tried to strip down our message and make it a short negative threat and then a positive call to action. So I'll just give you a feel for what our message sounded like. This bill is the threat to local control, the bedrock of Wisconsin democracy. And the governor's done so much for local communities with shared revenue and fair maps. We asked him to continue his great work and veto AB 957. So it kind of gives you a feel for the message. We actually wanted to point to some of the great work the governor's done in other areas so that he felt like we were recognizing him. and had a negative threat and a positive call to action. Our second area was mobilization, and our network really has two kind of levels of members. The first is the grass tops groups that we call them, and then we have our grassroots people. And the grass tops groups, we call them the kind of the traditional nonprofits, the ones who have like boards of directors and write grants, and SRAP would be one of them. And we got 16 of those groups together to sign a letter to the governor. And that letter was technical, very technical. But it also at the very beginning had our top line message, threat to local control, governor's great, keep up the good work. But what it really did is it laid the context for that bill so that the governor's people understood it. Cause again, it was an obscure bill. And then it laid out the arguments that the governor could use in a veto message. So it had that, had 16 recognized grass tops groups. Then we had our grassroots groups, and those are really just citizens who have been pushing back on the livestock industrial complex for years. We created a short call to action that went out by email and social media through those individual people. And that message directed people to a landing page so that they could go to a landing page that one of our groups put together. There was a sample letter to the gov there, and then a really easy access to the governor's portal. And the governor's staff wanted all that stuff to go through the portal so they could count it. Then our final area that we worked on was the media. And so we worked directly with the state level media on this deal because we really wanted to raise the profile of the bill in our capital city of Madison, because again, it was an obscure bill. And also because at the end of session, the governor literally gets like hundreds of bills that he needs to veto. I think he vetoed 167 or something. It's like a huge number. So we needed to, raise the profile, and we actually were able to get into some of the roundup articles that were written. Then we also were lucky enough to get a 30-minute meeting with the governor's senior staff policy person who's in charge of DNR and our Department of Ag. So on March 29th, just 17 days after this monstrosity got off the Senate floor, our work with the grass tops and the grassroots paid off, and Governor Tony Evers did veto the legislation.
Yes, that's amazing. And the timeline, 17 days.
It really was 17 days.
That's amazing. And I so appreciate like your mind and how you're thinking about this and sharing kind of the thought process with folks. And I know that you've also kind of been reflecting on this process and like thinking about if you have to do this again, what would be more helpful, or, kind of how do you track the number of folks who are activating on this? So do you have thoughts you'd like to share with folks about that?
Yeah, it's kind of, we thought that the governors, because we were running everything through the portal, that we would get to hear how many folks actually sent a message. All we know for sure from the governor's office was a lot. But 3 of our groups were able to track how many people went from their websites to the portal. And we think that's around 700. But then there were still hundreds of people who just went directly to the portal without going through our websites. So one of the things that we dream of, I know they have this in some states where the groups all have their data in one database, and you can activate the database fast and relatively easily, and be able to tell what's going directly to the portal. So some sort of partnership where our data is more organized, I think would really be helpful.
Still over, did you say 600 or 700? 700?
Well, we know for sure that it was more than 700.
That's
Yeah. So it was, it was a good short ask. People could just boom, get it done. It was very clearly a stupid bill. And it was very clearly part of a larger strategy where they're trying to, our industry is suing the DNR right now, saying they don't have state authority to regulate CAFOs. And then this was their strategy to stop local authority. So it's pretty easy to articulate that they really want no authority.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you so much for recapping that. And you're so right. Like in the heat of a session, we do have to be so responsive sometimes. So I'll be curious to hear from some other panelists too about their approaches to that. And threats to local control are not lost on us Missourians, right, Melissa? I'm going to queue up Melissa Vatterott next. So Melissa serves as the policy director at the Missouri Coalition for the Environment. Her journey with MCE started as a legal intern focusing on agricultural permit review and conducting research on the food system landscape. So this sparked her passion for environmental advocacy. Melissa holds a law degree and a bachelor's degree in environmental science and a minor in agriculture economics. Leading MCE's policy department, she collaborates with various governmental bodies at the federal, state, and local levels, emphasizing community engagement in tackling environmental concerns. And I am so fortunate to work with Melissa on a regular basis. And Missouri saw several bills this year of interest to advocates kind of in our movement, bills related to water quality. And MCE has been organizing successfully, I might add, to move some important legislation while at the same time combating industry attempts to weaken water quality protection. So Melissa, what would you like to tell us today about all the fantastic work that MCE has been doing this year?
Oh, Ashlen, that's so sweet. Lovely to be with all of you today. I am going to work on talking slow for the transcriber, even though that's not how I typically roll. So I'm doing my best here. Yes, I would love to talk to you guys about some great efforts we have seen while working with fellow grass tops organizations, as Lisa was referencing, as well as those on the ground, to figure out, what can we do that better protects these communities. Industrial ag has a very, very large presence in the Missouri state capitol. So trying to advance any type of legislation that would mute their power is a non-starter. And so looking at ways to address water quality, which has been the primary threat that community members are concerned about with regard to industrial animal agriculture, that is what we've been focusing a lot of our time on. So we have some quick history. I'll just say that 8 years ago, the legislature decided to change the makeup of the commission that reviews water pollution permits. And that bill became law, and it removed the requirement that 4 of the 7 seats be occupied by everyday people. So now, in effect, we have industrial agriculture interests sitting in all of those seats. And we felt it was time to revisit this need to reinstate what we call the public majority on the Clean Water Commission to balance interests. I would say that is the primary thing that we've been messaging, which I attempted to say in response to a question that came through the Q&A, that when our legislative bodies are too focused on one interest or one perspective, then they can't represent us all. So we have to be making sure that those who are in power and the legislation that they put forward, or in this Clean Water Commission perspective, the power they have to approve or reject permits or to approve proposed rulemakings, that they are balancing and considering all of the interests of the residents that are going to live near these places that could harm us, as well as any economic interests that may be causing these things to try to move through our state anyway. So we have had success in focusing on the fact that we all need clean water, and this Clean Water Commission needs to have balanced representation. I am hopeful that it's going to move. We were able to find sponsors in both the Missouri State House and State Senate, and they both had hearings 2 weeks ago. So we will see what happens there. So that is really positive. Organization, no one came to oppose. in person. How could you oppose bills that are about helping the public be in charge of protecting their water? You can't. And so I think that really helps. I guess what I'm trying to say is I'm giving you a specific example. I guess I'm jumping ahead, Ashlen. I'm sorry. Just thinking about messaging that I think we all can benefit from those core values. What do we want? Clean water, clean air, a safe, healthy environment in which we live. So I'm hopeful that these bills will move forward, and that's very exciting. At the same time, we saw a bill filed in both the House and the Senate seeking to change the definition of waters of the state. This was a misinformation campaign based on the fact that the US Supreme Court had a decision come down about a year ago, changing the definition of waters of the United States. And if you're not familiar, these definitions impact how the EPA and then your state agency that, you know, has been delegated EPA authority govern water in your state. So the EPA has authority over waters of the United States, and then the states can have a more protective definition of waters of the state. Well, there were some big ag interests that decided that we need to change waters of the state because waters of the US changed, and they sought to weaken protections for wetlands, groundwater, which almost a half of Missourians rely on groundwater for drinking water. So that is a serious concern. And I had another note about that bill and I don't know where it went, but what was great is that multiple people came out. I mean, hydrogeologists came out, stream teams, you know, experts came, the Missouri Farmers Union came out. So we made sure that as many diverse folks who care about water could come to the hearings and debunk the misinformation that this change was necessary. And fortunately, we were able to get media attention around it, and the bill sponsor really didn't know how to defend his bill. So that's positive. I will stop there to make sure that I'm covering what was desired.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Melissa. And we know that this is just a number of things that you all have been organizing around. I'm curious if you could speak a little bit to something that Lisa was kind of raising about, like, when we have to respond quickly, like how can we mobilize networks and encourage our allies to do the same? So I know in Missouri, like, you all have done some work to kind of like prepare for this exact scenario because we've seen it year after year after year. So I guess what would you add to that idea about how we can like ramp up for mobilizing people during session?
Yeah, great question, Ashlen. And I know every state might have a different length of a legislative session, but in between sessions, which I call the off season, we try to get together with our partners, our grass tops partners, to talk about these threats or these opportunities that we are anticipating, and make sure that we are all on the same page about the needed messaging and what do we literally need made in terms of who's going to create a fact sheet, how many people are going to communicate about it, commit to communicating about it with their bases, right? They're like email followers or social media followers and such. And so from there, MCE, so that we usually bring people together in the fall, and then the end of fall into early winter, I guess when I'm saying the end of a given calendar year, we begin creating fact sheets on issues that we anticipate. We don't necessarily know the bill numbers yet, but we like anticipate the issue. And once the bills get filed, we add the bill number on it, and then we have those on our website. We encourage our partners to use them just because we made them. And yes, it's on an MCE template. We're not looking to take credit. We just took the time to make them, and it's useful to have consistent messaging. So I would say bringing folks together to anticipate, getting on the same page on what we will be anticipating, the capacity of your partners to do X or Y. Some partners do not go to the Capitol for various reasons, whether it's funding or no longer feeling hopeful that their legislator will ever listen to them, but they still have smart ideas, and they are still, so like, don't be discouraged if you don't necessarily go to the Capitol, but you have partners. Sharing a brain trust on what that messaging should look like is really important. And then most people have been willing to share information about bills and these fact sheets. So we kind of have them ready to go. We're building a bill tracker the month before, because in Missouri, pre-filing happens a month before session starts. So we get a little bit of a sense before the chaos begins. So that's what I would add. Coordinating with like-minded folks and creating communication materials, even if they're in draft form, before session starts.
Great thoughts. Thank you so much. Now let's jump to Michigan. So fun to have people representing so many different states. So Charlotte, thank you for joining us. Charlotte Jameson holds the position of Chief Policy Officer at Michigan Environmental Council. She leads by championing transformational policy making and advocacy, overseeing the Environmental Council's team of expert policy advocates, Additionally, she spearheads the Environmental Council's Climate and Clean Energy Program. And through that, as I understand, has been encountering some legislation around quote unquote renewable fuels, which is a greenwash disguise, as we heard in the last panel, for biogas from livestock manure. So Charlotte, I would love to pass it to you to talk about some of MEC's work this year, and also just how this renewable fuel bill showed up and what you all did.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to talk to you guys about this. I think this really is kind of the new frontier of the fight against biogas and biofuels. We in Michigan, I think, just sort of setting the stage before I get into the specifics of this policy. We have a Democratic governor. We have, for the first time in 40 years, democratically controlled House and Senate. And so there was a lot of expectation that the Democrats, during this legislative session, which is last year and then the rest of this year, would tackle some really historic environmental issues, and a top one being climate. And so we were pushing heavily for bills that would reduce emissions significantly from our power sector. As everybody knows, transportation is also a huge contributor to climate change. And so as discussions around what a climate package in Michigan would look like were taking place, folks were also including bills that would potentially, or legislators were including bills that would also potentially tackle transportation emissions. So we saw a large bill package get introduced in April of last year that was mainly focused on the power sector, but included one bill in there that was directed towards the transportation sector. And so that bill is what I wanted to talk to everybody about today. But I do think it's important to understand that this is, again, being couched within the broader conversation around climate and energy and how we're reducing emissions. So that bill is a clean fuel standard. For those of you who are unfamiliar with that policy, it's been adopted in a few other states, namely California, Washington, and Oregon. Minnesota is also heavily debating this, but has yet to adopt it. We saw it rear up in, I think, New York as well, but Michigan is sort of the latest frontier too. A clean fuel standard essentially is a program that requires fossil fuel refined and sold in a state to meet increasingly stringent carbon intensity targets. So in practice, fossil fuel producers would have to buy a bunch of low carbon credits from other transportation sources that have a low carbon intensity score in order to comply with this. So it's essentially a market-based system that does trading, right? Credit trading. To do this, what they have to do is they have to assign each fuel, so liquid or electric, a carbon intensity score, which is more or less akin to a carbon footprint or something similar. And then they would incentivize the use of those lower carbon intensity scoring fuels through this credit trading scheme. Proponents of low carbon fuel standards or LCFSs have said that essentially these market-based solutions will result in significant and sustainable funding for electric vehicle charging. So what we're seeing is a big push from electric vehicle charging companies and groups that support the transition to electric vehicles, which my group is one of them. But we're seeing a number of other groups whose primary focus is on that, supporting an LCFS because they see it as an opportunity to generate a lot of money for the build out of charging infrastructure. This may sound like a good idea, but in practice, it's really deeply flawed. And in reality, the LCFS that's been implemented in California and other states really is just a system that extracts billions of dollars a year from people at the pump and subsidizes crop-based and cow manure-derived fuel. And the way it does this, the fundamental problem is this carbon intensity score, which are calculated using a method of greenhouse gas accounting that leaves important sources of emissions from the calculation. So carbon intensity scores for biofuel and biogas don't take into account changes in energy and agricultural markets that could that have carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions. So there's a whole suite of sort of land use changes and other things that result in emissions that are being left out of how we're calculating a carbon intensity score. So in other words, the carbon intensity of fuels are not necessarily equivalent to the full climate consequences of using those fuels. And because of that, and because of the low carbon fuel standards reliance on biogas and corn ethanol in particular, we've seen that it's actually resulted in an increase in emissions, which is the exact opposite of what proponents of these policies have claimed will happen. And in California, for example, the low carbon fuel standard has led to increased use in corn ethanol, which has a higher greenhouse gas emissions associated with it than gasoline, but received a lower carbon intensity score. And that's to do with the flawed modeling and the flawed calculation. Additionally, in California, the fascinating thing about the biogas piece is that a huge number of credits and the funding that is generated from the purchase of those credits is going towards methane gas. 80% of the funding from this low carbon fuel standard in California has gone to methane gas. And that's because the way California calculates the carbon intensity score for biogas, they allow essentially the dairy farms essentially get a negative carbon intensity score. So those credits from those dairy farm operations are worth even more than an electric vehicle, for example, or a credit from an electric vehicle use of an electric vehicle, which is just on its face an insane thing to claim. So, that's kind of the ways in which an LCFS is exacerbating climate change in the places that we've seen it implemented, and some of the reasons why we, from a climate perspective, are pushing back on an LCFS. But I think it goes without saying to everybody here that carbon intensity scores also fail to account for the other environmental impacts from biofuel and biogas production. So, including water pollution, aquifer depletion, habitat destruction, and soil contamination and erosion. None of those things are really accurately accounted for within this carbon intensity score because they're looking at, again, carbon emissions. So that's another way in which the holistic view of environmental harm from an LCFS is not being taken into account. The other thing I would point out too, which I think is not as well understood, and it's not something that we had really known about until we started doing, Michigan Environmental Council had started doing work on pushing back on corn ethanol production, probably like a decade ago or so. But the combustion of ethanol in car engines also increases smog pollution. And therefore, higher blends of ethanol and gasoline exacerbate harmful air pollution. And this is particularly difficult for urban communities where we see a lot more traffic, a lot more production of smog. And also that's where we're already overburdened in terms of harmful air pollution. So the use of ethanol in cars also negatively impacts our air quality. And it's yet another aspect of this that's not taken into account in an LCFS. So we have been pushing back on the LCFS in Michigan from the climate perspective, also from the water and land use perspectives. But I will say that I think it's been really difficult. I think the biogas and biofuel industry has done a lot of work and are sort of getting cover from the electric vehicle charging industry to sell this idea that biogas and biofuels are really climate solutions, and legislators are buying it. And so we've been having to do a huge heavy lift to educate them in terms of the actual negative impacts of this, and to try to correct that misconception. And in some instances, having to fight our friends who we otherwise work with very closely on what is really actually positive climate legislation. And they, in this instance, are on the opposite side. So it's been a pretty difficult fight here, and I don't think it's over yet. The bills haven't really moved anywhere, but there's a lot of support for them from Democrats in the legislature. So we'll see what happens in the coming months, and we'll continue to kind of pound the pavement to hope it doesn't happen.
Yeah. Wow, Charlotte, thank you so much for that. There's so much good information in what you just shared. So thank you so much. I'm echoing some other folks who are saying they're going to need to rewatch these recordings just to digest all of the information we're getting. But I'm going to go ahead and move to our last panelist, Kendra, here for a bit. And then I think we'll have some follow-up questions for you, Charlotte. So Kendra Kimbirauskas serves as the Senior Director of Agriculture and Food Systems at SIX, or State Innovation Exchange. Kendra oversees SIX's rural sustainable agriculture and food systems work. She works with national staff at SIX and in-state and national partners to promote progressive agriculture policies and legislation in key states across the country. Kendra grew up on a Michigan dairy farm, and before coming to SIX, served as the Chief Executive Officer at SRAP. So I am forever indebted to her for taking a chance on a younger version of me. She has experience working alongside citizen groups, environmental advocates, and sustainable agriculture organizations to shape ecologically responsible farm and food policies at the state level. And her list also goes on because she's done some incredible work with Friends of Family Farmers at FOF in Oregon. But today she's here to help give us a bit of a broader perspective about the work that they're doing at SIX and how they're working alongside legislators and allies. So Kendra.
Thank you, Ashlen. It's so great to be back, and it is wonderful to see so many of my friends and mentors and folks who have inspired my work over the years. So thank you for being here. As Ashlen mentioned, I've had a long history of working on CAFO issues. I also work as my husband and I were regenerative farmers in Scioto, Oregon. And we also just came through a huge fight to fight back 13 million chickens in my local community. And I know you're going to get to hear about that story tomorrow from my dear friend Starla, who's on this call. But I just really want to shout out the Nebraska folks. Jane, your community really supported our community in helping us with all sorts of resources that we needed that ultimately led to a successful campaign. And then I also saw Jean Hagerbaum's Hagerbaumer's name up on the list too, and Jean has just been really instrumental in being an incredible researcher for our community. So just wanted to start off by giving those shout outs because we couldn't have done it without you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the State Innovation Exchange. We call ourselves SIX for short. So we are a national resource and policy center for legislators who want to work on progressive policy at the state level. And so for my role, I am helping state legislators who are progressive, who want to lean in and be champions on rural issues, agricultural issues, and all things food systems. And I want to give you a little bit of context for why it's really important to work with state legislators. Across the country, there are 7,558 state legislators, and those are all of the state legislators in all 50 states. And by comparison, there are 535 members of Congress. So these are the legislators who are working every day to pass policies that impact our lives, and particularly around the food and agriculture in the CAFO world. There's a lot of policy that happens at the state level, as you've already heard about today. And so if we were in a group in person, I'd ask you these questions and I'd ask you to raise your hand, but just to give some context and for you to think about some things, I want to just put these questions out to you. How many of you know who your state representative is and your state senator is? Okay. How many of you have ever met with your state rep or senator? How many of you have met with your state rep or senator outside of the Capitol building, outside of an issue area to build a relationship? So just sit with that. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I've learned since I've come to SIX. And as Ashlen mentioned, I came right out of advocacy. So as an advocate, my role was to put pressure on legislators to make them do what I wanted them to do. And I quickly had my assumptions about what being a legislator was, turned upside down. And so as an advocate, I assumed that legislators look like congressional members, right? Like they have all of this staff, they know all of the issues, they've been in the legislature for a really long time, they make a lot of money, they know what I'm working on, they know what I care about, and they are values aligned and want to do the right thing. But when I came in to SIX and I started having conversations with state legislators to really understand who they are and how they did their job, one of the things I learned was that most of them are not paid well. Most of them have no staff, and pretty much all of them had no backgrounds on the issues that I cared about. And so let me just give you a couple of examples. And I'll say there are some outlier states. Michigan, I'll pick on you. Michigan has a full-time legislature. They're actually paid pretty well and they have staff. They also have special staff. But some examples of some other states, Iowa, those legislators make $25,000 a year and literally have a desk and a part-time clerk. And the desk is on the floor of the legislature where everyone else is. Nebraska legislators make $12,000 a year. North Dakota legislators make $537 a month. And in New Mexico, legislators make no money. So think about this. If you are trying to be a legislator, but you can't pay your bills on your legislative salary, you're also working 2 or 3 jobs, plus you're doing things like parenting and caregiving, while also being a decision maker. So even if your values aligned, you don't have a lot of time to actually go out and do the work. So what ends up happening is that these legislators, I have not yet met a single person who's run for the legislature because they care about CAFO issues. They run because they care about education. They run because they care about working people. And while they are certainly values aligned with us on the CAFO issue, they don't know it. And so if you think about, if they get put, so the committees that deal with these issues are the rural agriculture and food systems issues, or committees, excuse me. And if you think about it, if you don't know anything about these issues and you get put on that committee, you're like drinking from a fire hose. And it's kind of embarrassing. I mean, put yourself in that shoes. Like, I don't really know anything about engineering, but what would happen if I was put on a committee where I had to sit and like pretend to be an expert on the issue of engineering? I would be embarrassed. I wouldn't put my neck out. I would stand back. And I would rely on people around me to help me understand these issues. So I want you to keep that in context when you think about legislators who are values aligned, who you're working with, who might not have the literacy on the issues that you do. So here's just a couple of things that you can do. First, build a relationship with legislators. We often get into this role of being very transactional with legislators. We talk to them when we want something. So think about trying to build a relationship with your legislator outside of the legislature. You can invite them to your farm, invite them out for coffee, go to their coffee hours. Support issue literacy, explain the issue and break it down. Get out of being a jargon giraffe. We get so wonky and talk in acronyms, CAFOs, NPDES. Who knows what that is? So stop being a jargon giraffe. And then think about legislators as strategic partners for change, instead of thinking about them simply as a transactional relationship to get what you want. So what does that look like when you treat somebody differently as a partner, as opposed to somebody who you want something from? And I will stop there.
Oh, but we want to hear more. That's so good. That's so good. So quick follow-up question to you, Kendra, and then we'll kind of zoom back out to the rest of the panel. Can you give us like some examples of what some of that collaboration with legislators has looked like for you all?
Sure. So I'll just give a couple that are sort of active in progress as we speak. This past November, we took 44 legislators from over 30 states to Tomcat Ranch outside of San Francisco. And Tomcat Ranch is a regenerative working ranch that's doing some really cool work around regenerative agriculture and rural economic development. And we took them there to basically have a teach-in for 3 days to understand what all of this was that we were talking about. And that has been a really cool, I'll just say that that's been really cool for us because there's been a ripple effect. So for example, we've had several Michigan legislators who came and they didn't even know that each other was interested in working on these issues. And so they were able to like build a relationship around these issues at this event. And that has transcended into continued work in Michigan. So they are just trying to get organized now and figure out what does it look like for us to work as a caucus on ag issues. And they were afraid to step on each other's toes. So that's something they are doing now. In Nebraska, we are bringing legislators from Midwestern states out to the community that's been impacted by the Costco chicken operations to talk to neighbors about what does it mean when these chicken operations move into our community. But then we're also juxtaposing that against a community that's been, that has regenerative farms and talking about what is it that, regenerative agriculture brings to a community. So really trying to just like treat legislators as humans and keep them in a learning stance so that they're not defensive on these issues, and build deep relationships as partners into the future.
Awesome. That sounds like some great work happening. Okay, so let's open some questions back up to the full panel. We have about 15 minutes. I have a couple questions that I want to ask, but if you have questions, sorry, I'm speaking too quickly. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A or the chat, and we will try to grab those. So we can think about like the different trends that came up in this conversation here, but also some that maybe we didn't mention. Bills like ag-gag laws, we see those cropping up year after year in various states. We talked about the tax on local control to limit or remove those protections we have at the local level, right to farm laws that would limit recourse for impacted neighbors. It seems that the most common trend across all of that is whenever communities or advocates seem to have a success in their given state to push back on this industrial livestock model, we can pretty much anticipate a bill immediately on the tail of that in the next legislative session to curb that success. So I'd love to hear some thoughts from you all about how we continue to organize when we know that that is likely the response from the industry. Would anyone like to speak to that?
I could jump in, and sorry, I just had the floor, but this is something I've been thinking about a lot. And I'll start maybe by saying that at SIX, our theory of change is that policy isn't the end all be all, it's permanence. So, you know, you can pass a bill just like Ashlen mentioned and have a success, and then you could have an administration change and that could go away just as, you know, quicker than it came to be. And we're seeing that in Oregon. We had a very successful Senate Bill 85. As a result, we have our local county was able to claw back some right to farm laws and put in setbacks for new livestock operations. And I'll tell you, I'm terrified that it's going to be upended with new elected officials. And so that's one of the ways that we are trying to kind of get around that is, again, not thinking transactionally, but thinking in deep relationship. So if your legislators, your decision makers are strategic partners in the work, it's a lot harder for them to reverse something later on because they see you as a stakeholder, they see you as a constituent, there's hopefully deep trust. And so as we're thinking about passing policy, if we're centering impacted people and partner organizations with legislators with the goal of building deep relationships, you can go through the messy policymaking process. And if there is a reversal on the other side, if there's a change, then hopefully, you know, our theory is that with deep relationships, those folks can hold people accountable. And there's sort of more of a sphere of trust and accountability, which makes it a lot harder to reverse something that's very popular.
Yeah, I think the other thing that I would add in is to kind of get out of your box. I keep hearing people talk about Democrats like they're going to be more helpful, but what we found is obviously that the Democrats aren't very helpful in many ways. And so where I live, it's all Republicans, and many of them are MAGA Republicans or super MAGAs. And so we built relationships with the MAGA folks and found commonalities with them, particularly around, you know, a lot of the meat that's being produced, and 60% of the soybeans all going to China, and, you know, other issues that you may or may not agree with them on, but you know, I wouldn't put all my eggs in the Democratic bucket, but and it's kind of different when you're dealing with people who may not share your value system.
Thanks for that, Lisa. And I'm curious too, you know, because these things, they will come up for a couple of years and they may disappear, they'll come back again, and you may be working with a whole new set of decision makers. I'm curious if folks, how are staffers and legislators receiving the messages that you're bringing them? Are you seeing any improvement in how they respond to the word climate, which, you know, climate change used to be kind of a bad phrase that you would avoid, but yeah, I'm curious if folks have thoughts on that, on any shifts for better or for worse even.
I think, you know, Kendra's point about relationship building, and Lisa's point about sort of like party, you know, not thinking about party are really important there. Because if you can build relationships with legislators, regardless of their political affiliation, they really do need help understanding these issues. And but they want to trust the people that are, advising them, right? And so how do you build that trust? It's constant meetings, it's, being provider of good information, etc. And I think if you can do that, then they will believe you when you come to them and say, hey, here's the data that we're actually seeing from other states who have implemented this policy, or here's the water quality monitoring data that we have from this CAFO facility. And they will believe what you have to say, and that can help then influence their opinion. But it's hard. I mean, again, like I said, when it comes to this renewable fuel debate in Michigan, we know that there's a lot of legislators who have already bought into this argument that biogas and corn ethanol are climate solutions. And it's really hard to get that untrenched when it's already sort of ingrained in legislators' minds, and when really influential corporations and stakeholders are telling them the opposite of what I'm telling them, right? So I think it's start early and it's start often. And yeah, legislation and policy ideas never really die. So we're just constantly refighting these fights every legislative session, it feels like, in the same form or in different forms.
Ashlen, I'd like to add a little bit to that. We have a strong conservative state here in Nebraska. All of our state and federal representatives are Republican. The thing that we have found to be very useful is numbers. The greater the numbers that come forward in opposition of bad bills and bad policy, the conservative representatives tend to shrink away from it. They really don't want to deal with hordes of emails and people coming to testify and keeping them in their committee chambers for 4, 5, and 6 hours like we have. So I would say keep your organizations strong, keep growing them, become more powerful just in terms of numbers, and in spreading the information, educating more of the public, so that when you do need to rally the troops, that they will be there to respond.
Thank you all. Those are great thoughts. And Charlotte, you hit on it a little bit, but we did have a question come through the chat about how do those relationships hold up when that influential corporation is funding their next campaign. So I don't know if anybody wants to address that idea.
I mean, I think the relationship holds up, but the legislator might still, do the opposite thing. And then I think it does help then to have, the Environmental Council is a C3 organization. We don't do electoral work, but there are other groups like the Michigan Sierra Club and Michigan League of Conservation Voters that do. And so it does help in those instances where the politics is coming into play, to have partners who can say, push back on from that perspective as well. I think that's been hugely helpful in terms of coalition work here.
If I could jump in to like the other side of the coin from what Charlotte has said, one thing that I've found is really helpful is doing your homework on the legislators. So whether you're new to the Capitol and so you're just trying to get a sense of what are the interests or checks that they're getting from other industries, or they are new to the Capitol. You've been around and we have freshmen coming in, like learning what they care about helps determine with whom to prioritize certain messaging. And also just, I feel like somebody on this call said, and maybe it wasn't this call today, maybe it was something else, but the idea of coming in hot, like don't come into somebody's office, like passionate with an agenda until you like have gotten a sense to know each other, always be kind and respectful. I've met some legislators who have said they understand, my concerns, but they're not, they say it indirectly, but they're not going to be able to, stick their neck out on this issue because of who is funding their campaign. And at least I appreciate when they just say that, so that, like, it doesn't mean we can't find common ground on something later, but on this particular bill, they're not going to be able to do it. And then I can prioritize energy elsewhere. I imagine that every state has something like what Missouri has, a Missouri Ethics Commission. You can look up the donations that every legislator has received on a quarterly basis. And that has been helpful to even understand certain behaviors. Let's say you're observing a legislator from afar, or like listening to them on the floor, and you're like, where'd they get those messages? If you go and see who's written them checks, it gives you better understanding and can help with your strategy and how you approach.
Yeah, and one thing that I've noticed, we have a very Republican legislature, but a Democratic governor. And when we were talking with the senior policy staff, we obviously, some of our grassroots people are very irritated with the DNR because they keep giving out these permits. But we found that the governor's policy person was pretty defensive about the DNR because they've been starved for resources by this Republican legislature. So I'm not, everybody's got their own lay of the land, but so often the grassroots people have been trying to get some kind of permit out of the DNR, and they're not going to get it. And so the legislators or even the governor's staff feel like they're attacking their side. So I hope I'm making that clear, but I just wanted to.
Yeah, you're actually making a segue for my last question. We've got 3 minutes left, because that's so true, Lisa. Like, we know that working on these different pieces of advocacy to try to make progress, a lot of times we hear like, the agency doesn't have funding for that, or we don't have the authority to do that. You'll have to go to the legislation. You'll have to go to state statutes. So I would love to hear really quickly from everybody, if we can, what steps would you suggest that groups or communities or even individuals take to start to bring these specific issues to the attention of decision makers to make these legislative changes that we need? We've hit on a lot of it, but give me a real quick summary.
Okay, well, I can start off. We have a term limited state senator by the name of Anna Wishart, and she was interviewed recently. She suggested that, she said, really, if you have a good idea, you literally should walk into your senator's office and present it. You have a real strong chance of that idea coming to life in the form of legislation that can change people's lives. Now, I'll preface that by saying, of course, you must be as fully prepared and educated as possible on an issue yourself before you present it to an elected official, and be prepared to answer their questions, because as it was said earlier, they don't know everything. They don't have opinions about everything. Issues come up all the time that they didn't anticipate when they were campaigning for office. So the best thing is to tell them why the issue is important to their constituents and to the community at large. If you have a personal story about the issue, tell that to them, because then it will connect them emotionally as well as intellectually to it. Organize others in your community to show up at state legislatures and local governing boards. Find out what the legal procedure is. Attend hearings. Be prepared to testify. One thing that we've been pretty good at is learn who the chief of staff is for legislators and their legislative aides, and approach them. Give them as much information as you can about an issue that you're concerned with and that you want the senator or whoever, the representative, to take up, because then if you can convince them, they will become advocates and sell it to the senator. Another one is engage your local news reporters, get them on the beat, let them know that this is an issue that the community is concerned about, and start asking them to attend hearings with you. events where you're talking about it to the public, so they can cover it in the media. And when legislators know that an issue is being covered by the news media, then they perk up and pay more attention. I've got other things. I know it's short on time, so I'll let others speak, but
I'll just jump in and echo all the things that are important. Everything that Jane said is correct. And MCE has been doing virtual webinars with freshman legislators. So emailing them and saying, hey, we'd love to tell you about these certain topics right at the beginning of session.
And I'll jump in and just say, treat them like a human, invite them out to your farm, show them what's going on, let them experience the smell, sight, sounds of the CAFO, and let them sit with that. And that'll go a long way as well.
Thank you so much, everybody. I wish I could give you all an hour because you have so much to share and so much great work being done, but we'll wrap it there and I'll pass it back to Sherry. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody. That was amazing. I want to say, just as a recap, I heard all kinds of things that were so important. The power of people, the power of knowing where the money's coming from, the power of good organizing, of good manners even, which I thought was super important and relevant to the conversation. But that building relationships, and I love what Kendra just said about treating them like a human. So thank you all for your insights in terms of really, creating change and going after change on a state level. I really appreciate all of what you added to the conversation. And then also I've been reading the notes in the chat. So thank you to all of our participants or our that are here and actually watching and listening and also contributing to the conversation through our chat. I've been reading and learning from you all as well. So I hope that you have enjoyed our 2 panel discussions today. We are going to show you a short clip about our Water Rangers program, which I mentioned earlier, teaches folks using EPA standards how to do water monitoring and essentially hold corporations accountable for the pollution that they're bringing to communities, and also to help community members work with agency officials to essentially provide information to them that they're getting on the ground in the water, and to help them do their jobs better, to be honest with you. So I want to just, if I can, cue up that clip, and then we'll close out the session for today.
Industrial livestock operations, also known as concentrated animal feeding operations, or CAFOs, are some of the worst polluters in the U.S. Raising tens of thousands and sometimes millions of animals in confinement generates a huge amount of waste that's frequently over-applied to farmland. Weak regulations and waste mismanagement often results in runoff that pollutes local waterways with nitrogen, phosphorus, heavy metals, and harmful pathogens like E. coli and salmonella. This pollution contaminates drinking water, causes fish kills, and makes waterways unsafe for swimming, fishing, boating, and other recreational uses. Rural communities are on the front lines of a water pollution crisis that threatens their health, environment, and quality of life. SRAP's Water Rangers program helps communities protect their right to clean water and hold industrial livestock operations accountable for pollution. We offer training in EPA-approved water testing techniques and provide residents with tools to collect and analyze water samples. For Lynn Henning, SRAP's Water Rangers program director, it's about the family farmers who have fed this country for generations. Her passion is to protect families, communities, family farmers, and other rural residents from the negative impacts of industrial agriculture.
It's important to me because I have 5 grandchildren, I have a community, and this is not what farming is. I believe that everyone should have to abide by the law, and I think that the water is the most important thing because you can't replace it. Once it's contaminated, it may stay contaminated.
SRAP teaches people how to effectively document and report pollution violations to regulators to prompt enforcement. The Water Rangers program helps communities reverse a decades-long trend of handing industrial agriculture a free pass to pollute. SRAP's Water Rangers coordinator, Cole Dickerson, knows that a healthy environment is vital to building healthy communities. By training community scientists in rural areas, he can compel regulators to take action against polluting industrial livestock facilities.
That's what motivates me, is just to be in a better place as a country. That can't be overstated. And then, yeah, I think it's just very empowering to for me personally, just to do what I can. And I know I get so much from working with folks.
If an industrial livestock operation poses a threat to your water, contact SRAP for support.